All right. Well, thank you for joining us today. And this is the next episode of the Grim Wisdom Podcast. The idea, as always, is we're going to give you more truth than you can possibly handle, and you're not going to thank us for it. With me today is Mike Arujo, and it's a real honor to have him on the podcast. I mean, really like and respect you, Mike. And I feel like every time I talk to you, I come away with a greater understanding of how screwed up the world is, which is really sort of the theme of this podcast. So I'm sure that we've got lots to talk about. But why don't you tell us a little bit about your work here at Jobs with Justice before we get down to the ugly parts?
The ugly, sure. Well, Rhode Island Jobs with Justice, we're a coalition organization of about 50 labor, faith, and community groups. We work on everything from wage theft to direct action to policy campaigns to labor support when it's time for folks at the picket line. Try to put labor in like an anti-racist and anti-bias frame.
So yeah, it's awesome. It's awesome work that needs to be done for sure. And I just noticed when I walked in here, there's a big legislative push this year here in Rhode Island. For those of you that don't follow politics, and my two Oregon listeners, the issue is that undocumented immigrants can't get driver's licenses. So even if they file taxes, even if they pay taxes, even if they have no criminal activity, they still can't ever get a driver's license. And so oftentimes they're forced to become lawbreakers based on the simple fact that they can't be legitimized when they're driving a car to and from work. And so there's been this push to get them access to driver's licenses. And really, I think that the bill we have is it doesn't go as far as I would like, in terms of they have to have filed taxes for 2 years and this and that and the other thing. I mean, it's very presumptive of, we're only going to let the quote good ones, unquote,
right,
have this privilege of a driver's license, instead of, hey, let's just make it easier for people to get out of the shadows, right? I mean, if you think that there's something insidious about immigration, you should still be in favor of the legislation, I would think, because it makes it so people aren't pushed into the shadows,
Yeah, it seems like a relatively easy kind of logical thing. Safer roads, you have registered vehicles, people buy insurance. It regulates something right now that's hidden. And so on that level you would think it was good, but no, the opponents are against it on any level.
Right.
Then from a moral standpoint, you don't want people putting their families or their freedom at risk every time they go to work.
Mm-hmm.
It just doesn't make sense. If you have to go to a PTA meeting or if you have to go to the doctor, you should not be taking access to your family in your own hands. It shouldn't work that way. And then from a foundational principle, the whole point of founding myth of the United States is no taxation without representation. And so just as a principle, full participation of immigrants in our society should be something that we're looking for constantly, not making harder. I mean, it doesn't really make sense. So, like, this kind of love of this exclusive vision of Rhode Island is something that is actually really destructive in the larger sense. And so anything that mitigates that is something that Jobs with Justice is always going to work on. And driver's license is a start. The downside, of course, is that it's a second-tiered license. It's a segregated license. And so it's the best solution that we could come up with that was passable. It's still not a good solution.
Yeah.
Because it's saying as soon as somebody looks at this license, they can't use it for ID, they can't use it for banking. It's simply to use the roads, and it's marked. So it's really, I support it. It's going to make people's lives better. And we're going to be working on it and trying to make sure it's passed, but it should be going further. We should be doing much more.
Yeah, I think obviously the issue is that the opponents, they object to anything that legitimizes this population in any way. They're perfectly happy to profit from their
Right.
existence.
So like we all benefit from immigration in a very, very real and very measurable way. Not just in like the revenue taxes sense or the income sense. It's more the social and cultural our world is better when there's more people participating in it. As soon as we start to cut people out or make them feel unsafe, we create a chilling effect and doesn't allow people to take full civic part of their that is their right as human beings, not citizens, not members of a group, but as just human beings. They have a right to be part of our world, and I want them part of our world.
Well, I think that's interesting, and that's I want to get back to that phrasing, your phrasing of the myth of no taxation without representation, which I love. I want to come back to that in a moment, but before I do, I wanted to say, so the governor, and just for people that don't know, our governor, who I despise with the white hot passion of 1,000 dying stars. She was recently named one of Forbes' greatest leaders or something. She got some sort of award for
Top
being
50.
Top 50 awesome
Top 50
leaders.
world leaders.
Right, because she is so relentlessly committed on any issue of principle. She can blow where the wind goes, but on issues of oligarchy, on issues of economic justice and distribution of wealth, she is completely 100% full-voicedly committed to the ruling class, right? Doing everything she can through the tax structure, the regulatory structure, to move money from the pockets of the masses into the pockets of the few at the top.
Right. So the governor made a promise before her inauguration. She actually signed a letter saying that she would write an executive order giving people licenses. And then she immediately demurred. And, as soon as she got elected, she walked that back as fast as she could and said, no, it's the responsibility of the General Assembly, that she doesn't want to force something down their throats. Well, she's the executive.
Right.
So lead.
Yeah.
And so there's something very, very frustrating about having that that conveniently two-toned position of saying, on the one hand, I'm going to make statements as governor that are empirical because I'm the governor, and then immediately cry to beg for democracy when it's something that actually might take moral courage.
Yeah.
The other part of that is that she's a committed neoliberal. She is absolutely committed to a version, like a business narrative of Rhode Island. And so, and that matches the narrative that our legislator gives, which is that if it's good for business, it's good for everybody. And the fact is that's simply not the case. That's not, trickle down doesn't work. It's never worked. Business doesn't have your interests at heart. They have their interests at heart. Sometimes there can be a coincidence, but for the most part, you have to fight for yourself. There's a profit motive in keeping people in shadows. That's very, very important to remember. And so if there's a group that's benefiting, you have to look to that group. And so as a neoliberal, it does serve business to have a population that is slightly less than legal and slightly less than above board, because you can pay them less, you can treat them worse, and you can dispose of them. That's a business model. That's not a social model. That's not a political model. That is a business model that's being followed.
Yeah.
And by denying people access to driver's licenses, you're limiting their ability to travel. You limit somebody's ability to travel, you have taken away the amount of opportunities that are open to them. And the irony of the whole thing to me is that these free market liberal, neoliberal people are always claiming about how there's a market solution to everything, but anytime that applies to labor, they push back as hard as they can. And this is one of those things. It's a second-tier license. Allow freedom to travel. It'll allow people to negotiate better deals for themselves because they can go farther afield to find better rates. That normalizes and supports better wages and better conditions for everybody. It's completely ridiculous. The governor has driven me up a wall on this one.
Well, she's done this to a variety of liberal or progressive, let's just say left wing, as a broad term, causes since being elected. And I think it's also important to note, for those of you who don't follow politics too closely or who are fortunate enough not to have to live here in Rhode Island, it's important to note that she didn't win a majority in either the primary or the general. Most Democrats wanted someone else, and then in the general, most Rhode Islanders wanted somebody else. but because they couldn't agree on who the somebody else should be, she got to be the governor.
Right. So this kind of goes into the license thing pretty clearly. The governor did not win suburbs. She did not do good in the white population of Rhode Island.
Mm-hmm.
She didn't. She got outright winged by a libertarian and a Republican, and in the general election, and she got outright winged by a Latino former mayor in the primaries.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he did not support driver's licenses for undocumented workers.
Right.
And she did. And that made the difference in her election.
Yeah.
The places that carried her and the people that carried her were Providence, Pawtucket, Central Falls, Woonsocket, Fifth Ward of Newport. These are African American and Latino regions.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't a majority of the white women of the East Side voting for her, even though they did. It was that coalition that came together because she made very explicit promises about doing right.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of the African American community, she did not deliver on any of the promises about having a more open cabinet and having equity as a central issue. She's had to be pressured. She made one African American hire to a cabinet level position, and it was also one that is traditionally put towards African Americans.
Right.
We work what are called, or in the General Assembly, like the softer education, medical care, housing, never judiciary, never labor, never corporations. And that is reflective of what she thinks where the power is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's very disappointed. Not surprised, but very disappointed.
No. I think anyone who, sadly, as I talked about in my last podcast, so repeat viewers will know, one of the things I talked about before is that when I was talking to Bob Plain in my last podcast, we talked about how most voters just don't have the time. There's this concern about the media, and he pushed back, and he made the very good case, I think, that we have access to a greater variety of media than we've ever had with the internet. Ordinary chumps like myself can just get a computer and a podcast together, right? Although that still presupposes that you can afford a laptop, which, leaving that aside, we definitely have a lot of different places to get our information. But with that comes the consequence of, in order to really be informed, you need to spend more time focusing on it. You just don't have time when you haven't gotten a wage increase in 40 years and everybody's working 40 plus hours.
No, and that's actually that's a big, very, very big part of it. So like Rhode Island has what's like a top-down recovery in process right now. Like our unemployment rate did drop after several years, but the jobs that people are getting are not good jobs. They're simply not. Both in the average household, both parents have to work. Older people have to work for longer. The actual physical hours that they work during the course of a day are harder and more grueling. But our productivity is significantly up at the same time. It's someone described it to me as Rhode Island has Schrodinger's workers, right? So we're among the most productive in the country, right? Rhode Island's workers, each worker's output is high, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Our productivity is remarkable nationwide.
Mm-hmm.
Yet we are considered constantly being told that we're the least educated, that business is going to leave because we're not smart enough, we don't work hard enough. You can't be both. We can't be both lazy and the most productive at the same time. People need to be less productive. They need to have communicating that fact to each other needs to be part of the conversation, and we're not talking about it. People simply don't have the time. Media can do so much. It can illustrate, it can highlight, it can really lift up these things, but the way that the conversation has, and the way that ownership of the conversation happens, is in one-on-one conversations, worker to worker, advocate to worker, and that kind of over dinner, over coffee, whatever it takes. It's that personal connection is the whole thing. Like when I was working as an organizer in Texas, I had a terrible job. I did not well. I mean, arguably over time it worked out. And I was going up to each work, men who look like me, well, not black men, but men who were my age anyway, and trying to get them to join a union, and it wasn't working. It simply wasn't happening. So I was told by a very, very old union organizer, and I was trying everything. I was trying to get on the radio, I was doing events, was you just need to go over to their houses and talk to their moms. Talk to their moms, or talk to their wives about, do you want your kid to go to the college of their choice? Do you want to be able to afford whatever clothes that you want to afford? And just put it back in that real ownership issue and then make them understand it. So if I talk to a person who works in the movies for one of the IATSE locals, you can ask them any question about tax policy and tax credit. They can give you a really thoughtful answer about it, about how certain types of stimulus work versus other types of stimulus and how the shape of that stimulus. If I talk to a teacher, they will understand all the nuance of teaching policy, of Common Core, of pension policy, medical policy. If I talk to a nurse, they know every in and out of Medicare, Medicaid, Right Care, and all the insurance companies. The ability of people to understand these issues isn't something that's lacking. It's the coordination of the issues.
Yeah.
For most part, all those groups are labor, relatively organized groups, but that doesn't mean if I go into a gas station and ask a gas station attendant about what the nuance of his job, or what affects his job are, he can give, or she can give me a real, solid, thoughtful answer at the end of the conversation. One that will have an impact on their job and on their family. We're just not doing that. We've taken shortcuts for too long. We've also professionalized the job of an organizer, which is a huge mistake, even though I sit here as a professional organizer.
It says the professional
It says
organizer.
the professional organizer. No, is that we've
It's good enough for me, but
we've
no.
we made it mastery, and it's not something that's mastered, and I think that's the way that you should think about it. Is that it's because it's like a ongoing process, and we have this massive problem. Like we have the environment, the high tides in Rhode Island are 9 inches higher than they were last year. There's a direct impact on that. Kids don't get recess, or when they do get recess, they're marched around a yard like they're in prison. They're not allowed to laugh and talk. That's an issue. But all of them are kind of connected, and we've made it so that way an organizer seems to be the only one. It's like a religious order where we have specific answers, and we've just kind of taken shortcuts to the actual work of going and talking to the moms and talking to the grandmoms and saying, what do you think this is going to mean for your kids? What does a 9-inch higher high tide mean for you? Like, what's going to be the ultimate impact when you, are you, for the clam diggers in Warwick, are you going to be abandoning a lifestyle that you've been able to hand down from father to son and mother to daughter for generations? Is this something that you're going to have to rethink? That we issue statements. We need to start having the conversation again.
Well, I think one of the philosophical underpinnings of this podcast, and really the way that I live my life, is I sort of have forsworn ever becoming a master of anything, right? My goal is to have at least a passing familiarity with everything.
Yeah.
To be the ultimate jack of all trades. But you can't both be a master of one craft and a generalist. It doesn't really work that way.
No,
You
very
know?
few people can pull that off successfully.
I really, there might have been somebody at one point in time, but I think
Noam Chomsky.
perhaps so. I never having had the privilege of speaking to him, it wouldn't surprise me if the breadth of his historical knowledge just makes him seem like more of a generalist than perhaps he is. He might not be able to speak effectively on his broad variety of issues. But, I mean, if I ever had a chance to speak to him, that'd be an interesting thing to unpack. But I guess my point is more about how much that desire for mastery, that is, in a way, it's part of the system's methodology,
No,
right?
it
Is to
absolutely-
indoctrinate you
Right.
into, because the perfect cog is just a cog, right? There's nothing else to them.
Right. So that's really kind of a good way to think about it. I learned what I know by just being told to go do it. Right. So I was told to go be an organizer. I was terrible. And so
And eventually, I got this job.
right. 40 years later, I got better. But I also, working as a steward, I had to learn contract language at the same time. Right. So you do gain an expertise doing that, but at the same time that's going on, there are people who are coming out of colleges who are working as interns who get that almost on. They're given that room before you. And so like I was, as an organizer, there were no cell phones and no pagers, right? So nobody could really check up on me. So I was allowed to really kind of fail spectacularly. That's not true. It wasn't that bad. But I was able to make mistakes and give myself room for mistakes and then figure out the questions I need to ask. I wasn't so tightly supervised that I was allowed to develop my own process for that. As a steward, similar. I had to develop my own process to do that. But when I was doing that, you seek out mentors, you seek out people who can give you advice, but it's got to be sort of like an autodidacticism instead of like a handed to you. So now what we're seeing is like kind of like an internship tyranny. I think is kind of a good way to think about it. It's like people who have access are given more access through internships or the ability to have internships. And I think that we're not intentional about how we do that. So like a kid comes to me from Brown and will have 20 hours available to them to putter around a database and kind of learn all those connections that kind of exist. It's great. It's a huge help. I don't have to teach them how to operate. I don't have to do anything. You can kind of just plug them in, minimal supervision, and they can do that. But that's a traditional intern, right?
Yeah.
The minute that's going on, it's like I know that right down the street at the high school, there are moms who are significantly younger than me, who are in their 20s, who have kids who are going to school, who would love to have access or would be a huge asset and would democratize the way the organization works. But in order to do that, we have to create structures that'll fit them, not the other way around.
Yeah.
And so, since most, ironically, like organizing or labor-based or any of those organizations don't offer good childcare, very few of the nonprofits do or social justice services do, they have to make that measure of how many hours can I devote to that. If they can only do 2 hours a week, are they gaining real expertise?
Yeah. Well, then who can afford to, who's got the life goals that they want to check off, intern on their resume, who's got the time and the money and the space to do it? Well, members of the ruling class, people that can go to Brown, by and large.
Right.
Not
so guys that come out of, the men and women that come out of prison also should have access to it because they've had a whole section of their lives taken away where they might have been able to do it.
Yeah.
And there's like a fear because of levels of supervision and because of what's expected, we don't make room. And so, that's kind of like what I try to do. I try to make sure that there's room for folks because the messages that are coming out of organizations right now are missing their mark because we don't have those folks. I mean, that's really what it is that we don't have young moms sitting in union hall offices as organizers or as stewards or as leaders saying, well, you can't schedule a meeting at 5 p.m. because that's dinner time.
Yeah.
Because you can't. Or the people who show up at the meeting are people who don't have to worry about kids, which that changes your contract language or changes your policy outcome by doing that. If you schedule things too late at night, people can't show up. Or if there's drinking or if there's whatever, like you have to measure who the audience is or who the people are and then go after that.
Right.
And I think that we've allowed a lot of what could be progressive values and should be progressive values to slip away because we're missing those voices.
Right. I mean, it's not so much an issue where you're making a decision based on a person's, on what's the time that's going to get the best most people here. It's just always expediency, and if you make too many expedient decisions, over a period of time, it leads to.
Right, and and not to be like I don't mean to run folks down. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done. Like there's a huge amount of work to be done, And so you don't always have that much time that you can devote to actually mentoring somebody or training somebody through the process. But by not doing that, we're actually bolstering the system the way it is right now instead of taking it apart.
And that's something else I talked about in the last one. That's another thing that I think bears repeating. It's sort of a truism with me is the systems of oppression, they tend to become self-correcting and they tend to become more robust over time in the same way as biological systems like evolve over time to create an ecology where all the parts work together, to process energy and so forth in really mystifying ways. So too, if you, that's in the absence of intent, so obviously biological systems, there's no, well, we believe there's no designer, there's no intelligence that's,
Some of us believe. Yeah,
right, I suppose there's, I don't think anyone who's listening to this podcast, but there's no designer, there's no conspiracy, right? And that's the whole point, right? Is that there isn't somebody sitting down thinking diabolical thoughts. There's no bald man petting a white cat thinking, hey, if we can only make it so that people work 60 hours a week because they need that extra money that the overtime provides, and they feel grateful to the employer for providing it, then they won't have time to get informed.
Yeah,
so they'll never organize.
So
so then we can extract our tyranny from it. There's nobody sitting around doing that, but
well, yes, I don't like. I'm not a conspiratorial person, but the systems. The same, one thing I've learned over the years is that I should always give people, anyone I'm talking to, or any target, or good guy or bad guy, the minimum credit of my intellect, which is not much. It's like a, but they're least as smart as me, probably a little bit smarter. I always make that assumption. I always make that assumption. And I sit with organizers, and I sit with other organizations, and we make very, very long, pretty elaborate plans that involve lots of moving parts, that involve lots and lots of steps. That each one sort of has to be executed properly, and if they don't, there's a plan B, and then plan B, it's kind of like a write your own adventure. Mm-hmm. But the outcome is almost always, the goal of the outcome is always the same. No matter what it is. Like if it's driver's licenses, it's like that. To assume that there isn't an oppositional part to that is, I think, a mistake.
Well, it's more that I'm not saying that there's not a conscious opposition that's aware, that is intentionally devising narratives that are harmful. Obviously the Koch brothers are sitting in their, secret mountain hideaway somewhere, hatching new BS narratives.
When did they become Koch?
I don't know. I think of them as the Koch brothers.
Right, well, it's like Boner. Boehner became Boner over the
right.
He was called Boner before.
Yeah, I mean that's how his name was spelled, right?
The memory hole.
Whatever. So the Koch brothers, they're sitting in their secret mountain lair somewhere, coming up with narratives they know are bogus, right? But by and large, I think the way the system works is the system doesn't reward. Power doesn't derive from intelligence; it derives from complicity.
Yeah.
Right. And so you can have people who to all intents and appearances appear so dumb, you're amazed they're smart enough to put on their own socks. I mean, you have people like Speaker Mattiello, the Speaker of the Rhode Island House, and he's not a tower of intellect, right? I mean, maybe we're not very bright, but as I feel pretty confident. I feel confident making the statement that we're brighter than him, but and he's not even, he has no reserves of charisma or intelligence. He's just really willing to be complicit. He's really good at just saying, oh, my neighbors told me their taxes are too high, so it must be true, right? And that's all. And if you look at, I've heard other people talk about other political figures across the state, other people in other states talk about it too. Like over and over again, you get these people who, can, who they can barely fog a mirror. They're so dim. They're so devoid of so many of the things that make an aware human. But they understand on some level. They have some sort of cunning that allows them to leverage their family name and connections, right? And their total deafness to anything outside of their world makes them able to rise, because that's how the system works. It rewards complicity, not intelligence.
Right.
I don't think, for example, Raimondo, to give everybody a history lesson, Raimondo, when she was treasurer, she perpetrated a massive fraud on state pensions, right? There was a small problem, perhaps a moderately sized problem. She dramatically exaggerated the size of the problem.
Self-inflicted. It was a self-inflicted problem.
Right, and we could talk about how the history of that problem comes from, again, from politicians making bad decisions in the past, not serving their constituents' true interests. But, she took a problem that was a real problem, but that was a manageable one, exaggerated it, and then exploited that crisis to funnel a bunch of money to hedge funds at the same time as she was stealing people's retirements, essentially.
Right.
And it wasn't really that smart. I mean, people give her credit for cunning, for intelligence, but I don't think it was that hard to understand. I could sit down with somebody in 15 minutes, unpack the issue for them so they could understand how it was a fraud. But it was really effective because it was complicit. It was super complicit. And it proved forever to the people that she was relying on for long-term ambitions that she will do anything to protect their privilege.
Right. So, all right.
So then Fortune can list her as one of the best leaders in the world.
Right. Well, because she made a fortune.
Oh, yeah.
For a lot of people, she made a lot of people.
Yeah. Well,
very,
and
wealthy.
let's not forget herself. I mean, she has this legal fiction of a blind trust through which we can't say with certainty, but it's highly unlikely that she didn't directly launder money from the state coffers into her own pockets using this blind trust.
Right. I mean, because hedge funds by definition are opaque.
Right.
Since you have the prospectus never puts the actual prospective outcome is going to be. Mm-hmm. You never know what the fee is going to be. You never know. I mean, that's the whole point. It's one of the best invented tools ever.
Right.
If you're that kind of person. But I think, so there's a systemic, so in Jobs with Justice, we apply an analysis to every problem. So we look at a global problem. So like we're working on Section 8 housing right now. It's one of the subjects that we're working on. So the problem is housing discrimination or discrimination. So say racism is the problem. One of the issues of that problem is housing. Mm-hmm. And so then we look at the target that is and say, like, who is responsible? Like, who can we pin this on? And then we figure out the relationship that person has, and we try to do whatever we can to move that person. All of it, though, at the end of the day, is a single issue. I mean, a single problem. And we say all these parts about, like, the hedge fund managers stole a huge amount of money through the complicity of the governor. People are working multiple jobs at huge rates of productivity that are being really destructive. Driver's licenses are being denied people who come to this country to work, forcing them into really substandard and dangerous conditions. We see a prison population that's burgeoning and deadly at the same time, where people are saying a profit. All of that, plus tides are up 9 inches than they were a couple of months ago. Right. So all of those things create, like, if you're working on like a mosaic and you're looking at each little tiny tile, you're like, man, that's terrible. I'm putting that down. I'm going to stick that right there and fix it. As soon as you step back, you're like, well, this is a gigantic structural problem. And the problem is that nobody's really saying it. Like, folks actually have to say that capitalism is a destructive force in its entirety, that the benefits that it delivers are at such a high cost that I don't know that it's a benefit. I also don't know that we should give up thinking about alternatives to it. And I think that so much of the conversation has been steered away of us putting, like, the work we do at Jobs with Justice or any other social justice organization, we're doing the best we can to make things better for working people, the same way unions do and the same way every other social justice organization does. But at the end of the day, the best we're doing is putting a Band-Aid on a cancer. Mm-hmm. Is that we're mitigating some aspect. We're treating a symptom. We're not going after the actual disease. Alienated families, teachers held to impossible standards, eroding infrastructure, all of these are symptoms of a capitalist problem.
I think that's very right. And if I could just interject, so many of my 5 or 6 listeners will have heard me use this phrase before, but I just want to unpack it in case anyone hasn't heard it. So there's a phrase I use, saving starfish. There's an old fable about a kid walking down the beach, throw a starfish back in the sea, does the next day, the starfish throws them back, and somebody says, well, why do you do it? There's just going to be more starfish. Doesn't make a difference.
Makes a difference
The kid
to
says,
that
makes
one.
this and that starfish,
Yeah.
right? Well, so to me, if you're saving individual lives, but you're not addressing the systemic problem, you're saving starfish.
Right.
You can feel good about saving starfish, but, a million people walking on that beach throwing back starfish, they're all going to be back on
Right,
that beach the
right.
next day, and and who knows what's going to happen if the oceans rise too. But
Right. Well, but I mean, with that, so like when I was working for unions, that's direct service, right? So that's you're serving members directly and delivering some impact to that person one on one or whatever the number of the membership is, and that's great, and it does change lives.
Right.
It like really has a very very serious impact, and that direct service and that direct model of organizing can't be undersold. That starfish, once thrown back, is an organized starfish.
well,
And that's really, really important. And it's like not to diminish that, but at the same time, though, if you could work on a contractual deal that wins, oh, okay, Teriyaki House, where we won direct payment for 13 workers of about $70,000. That's a significant thing.
Mm-hmm.
The conditions that allowed those workers to be robbed, however, is the thing that really needs to be gone
right,
after.
right.
But that doesn't mean that Fidel should be going without his money. Like Fidel still needs to pay rent, and it's really important that Fidel gets his rent. And I want Fidel.
No, it's true. It's true. I don't want to minimize that aspect of it, but I think that you have this global circumstances. We'll say capitalism, although it's even. I would say that the tyranny that we're living under, the problems that threaten humanity's immediate future, go even beyond the dysfunctional economic system. It's like when you have cancer and that cancer metastasizes, it causes a whole host of secondary problems,
Yeah, sure.
right, that then take on a life of their own.
Right.
Right. So we have to deal not only with the root cause, but also with some of the symptoms, which have now become so entrenched, they're giving rise to
Right.
tertiary problems themselves. But all these organizations are under so much pressure that the temptation to move from throwing back an organized starfish to just throwing back a starfish and not taking the extra time to organize him because
Right.
you've barely got the resources to throw back the starfish.
Right.
And then the people that are working on the broader problem, organizations there's tremendous pressure on those organizations to subvert them into tools for the system, right?
Oh,
so take, for example,
it's a huge balancing act.
Planned Parenthood and if you're not aware of this is, I'm sure there must be some people that aren't as strong on choice as me that listen to the podcast, but
Coalition members.
yeah, but so I'm very pro-choice. So Planned Parenthood, their political advocacy, they have a couple of different things that they do, right? They provide health care, especially to distressed populations. So they're a great organization. But from their political advocacy, their primary issue is the abortion issue.
Yeah.
Right? So they made a decision to endorse Raimondo in the primary and, of course, the general of this last election. And she absolutely betrayed them on every front.
Yep.
She not only... Rhode Island is now having an F for choice because Raimondo put forth this bill that, in effect, makes it illegal for any insurance plan to cover abortion. It's not quite... That's not the writing of it, but that's the...
It's pretty aggressive.
That's the outcome of the writing of the legislation. So basically, no insurance can they cover it, and she's also just gutting Medicaid as fast as she can, right? And then just today, the Economic Development Committee is going to have a meeting. They announce it with a 48-hour notice over Easter weekend,
Yeah,
so that on Monday everybody's sleeping off their hangover and recovering from the horror of their families. And meanwhile, these people are going to be salivating over the opportunity to hand out free money to their business buddies that they've taken out of the pockets of poor sick people through the Medicaid cuts.
That's right.
So not only did Planned Parenthood endorse her, though, they're now using the fact that Rhode Island is so terrible on abortion as a fundraising mechanism. And mark my words, when Raimondo runs again for something, they'll endorse her again.
Yeah, they will.
They will.
No, so that's like the balancing act, right? So I do a fair amount of policy work, which means participating in systems that are not great. right? So like I have to go to the General Assembly and I actually have to talk to people on occasion, which is
I've been there. I feel your pain.
yeah, it's not the greatest thing in the world. But it's a maximum amount of good, right? So we have to figure that out, and we have to make that balance of what's and at this with that you have to figure out how much hold do they have on you at the same time. Is there a tool that they're going to be using? Is there an opening that you're going to be allowing? Is your cooperation going to be seen as duplicity? Like, what is it? Like, what is it? And also, with your constituency, are you going to really be balancing their interests with that? Is this the
Right.
best tool that you could use?
And that's the thing that gets lost because of how power flows from complicity, right?
Right.
Is because the reward in power, the payoff in immediate power for a very moderate amount of complicity might be very high,
Yep.
right? It might be a very, you might sit back as a emotionless calculator of benefits, and you might say, this small betrayal of the core principles of the people that I serve is worth it because the power that I get from this small betrayal is significant and long lasting, right? But that's exactly how it starts always.
Yeah.
Right.
It's a very easy, and also depending on how much you're
Which is not to say, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it's not to say that that's wrong. I mean, I'm not in a position to say, and I've certainly made that decision at times where you work with somebody or you work under conditions or you grant your endorsement to something you might find objectionable. You make that decision. That's not a wrong thing to do, right? I'm not an ideological absolutist.
Yeah, no, and I don't. And I don't mean to make it sound that
Yeah.
way either. And I don't mean to make it sound like there isn't good that can come out of it. Like if you're able to win minimum wage increases for people, putting $1,000 extra bucks in somebody's pocket every year means something for real. Or if you're able to work on EITC, even though it's kind of a subsidy for low wages, it's still meaningful for those
Right.
folks, and that's the meaningful impact. It's the starfish. Like you're doing the right thing for as many people as possible. The risk, though, is that you could start to believe in the access.
And that is a very
power.
pervasive
Yeah.
risk, and that risk has brought low better men than you and I,
Yeah.
In the past.
And so and always
better men and women. I should say.
being on guard. Well, so to a much lesser degree, women. So I was speaking to legislators, a progressive, good person in every way, but is somebody who has been granted a great deal of access. This is access that I know people like Fidel and Floor would never, ever have.
Right.
Not in a million years. So is the access actually, is it a benefit? Like, do we really benefit by having that level of access? And, all right, so I'll go back a little bit. So I was working on the tip minimum wage campaign with Rock United, and we had Cale Keeble, who was a rep in Rhode Island, who lives in Foster, I think, on some Dixie Hollow Road or some ridiculous name like that. And so he has a favorite restaurant that he goes to, Wright's Farm. And I was like, well, I'm just going to go to Wright's Farm and organize the workers out there and talk to them, and I'll get them lined up. And everyone was like, a black tattooed guy out there, I don't know if that's going to work. And I was like, the reason, just by you saying that, means I have to be there now. Like, you've completely ruined it for me.
Right.
Like, I would have said, like, oh, maybe, is not providing them with the version of the story that they want to hear is part of the job of an organization.
Yes.
So if they would prefer to see a blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman saying something about low wages, don't give them, because that's not the actual lived experience of most people.
Yeah.
Like they have to hear it. Also, they are not that important at the end of the day. Like, they can help us pass legislation, they can do all this really wonderful stuff. If we're able to fill a hall or fill the streets with people and make real direct demands, they have to answer one way or another. Vote counts are too low for them to pretend that having 200 people show up in their district will not change something.
Yeah.
They can't, So they start to believe in the power of their access. They put on the little lapel pin and suddenly believe that that gave them a superpower. It's not.
Yeah.
You know, the chamber is not a force field. It's not, you know, it's just a room full of people who are mostly disconnected. It's our job to reconnect them or take them out.
Well, this has been, I mean, I just love to, I feel like I could talk to you for hours, but looks like we're already coming up on 45 minutes here. Wow. So
Yeah,
before...
you'll edit it down to 5 minutes. And
yeah, right. No, I think I'll maybe cut out just the uhs and the ahs, but it's funny, you can never please everybody with a podcast. Some people want it to be longer, some people want it to be shorter, you know, whatever. I just do what I want. You know, if you don't like it, you know.
yeah, don't listen.
That's the magic of the internet. So, but before I forget, I wanted to come back to that taxation without representation. Use the phrase myth for that, and I think that's a really great word, is myth, because of course everybody's taxed all the time without being represented. You know, I was just reading the new Jim Crow, which is an amazing book that everyone should drop whatever they're doing and read, and it's obviously particularly relevant to current events in a lot of ways, because we're having another Clinton run for office now at the presidential level, and the book really drives home that although Reagan started a lot of the problems it discusses, Bill Clinton expanded and perfected them.
Yeah, no,
and
he
got them to the point
honed
where
it.
they're
He
entrenched, beyond easy removal. And the book talks about that too. But this myth that we have taxation without representation, you know, we have whole populations where we've criminalized marijuana. We selectively enforce that law only on black people, right? So, I mean, not only, but
No, largely.
demographically,
Right.
demographically, you know, it's hugely disproportionate.
Yeah.
So we selectively enforce that law on them, and then they've gone to prison. And in many states, they can't vote forever. In many states, they can't vote for a period of time. I don't think any state they can vote while they're in prison, and that's actually quite unusual. All of that. Most European countries, you get your vote back right after you leave prison. In many of them, you can vote while you're in prison.
Vermont is the only one that lets that.
Yeah. So, but yet when they get out, I mean, they're permanently barred from a whole host of social services. You know, Section 8 housing. Apparently, if you can't get it if you're a felon, which I didn't realize until I read the book.
Well, you can, but the appeal process requires a tremendous amount of time and agency on the individual.
Right. If you're rich and you have a lawyer, then you can
you'll
get
be
around
fine.
it.
Right.
Then you don't need Section 8 housing. And if you can get some organization to make you the starfish they want to save that day, then maybe.
Maybe.
But you know.
Maybe.
But the point is, so they all, if they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, in getting jobs, and even if they're not working jobs, of course, they still pay sales taxes and use gases and gas taxes and all that.
And then the fees.
Right, and they pay all those fees. They pay all these taxes all the time, but they're permanently disenfranchised in many states, and disenfranchised for an extended period of time, even in most of the rest. So there's that, and of course we talk about undocumented workers, where they come here in many cases legally. You know, they come here on guest worker programs, and they undermine their own wages. It's amazing how many. I've met people where they are undocumented immigrants because they were brought in here from DR or Guatemala as farm workers. They're paid far less than American minimum wages, so they depress wages for everybody.
The employers
right?
depress it.
Right? And then, the employers, exactly. The fact that they're allowed to pay them such low wages depresses wages for all other people in America. And then the employers don't really care about the legal status of their employees. In fact, they're happy if they have a guest worker that's been working well for them for a number of years, and they decide to overstay their visa. They're happy to continue employing that same person.
Well, but I mean, that ends up being part of the entire equation. So you think about, when you say human trafficking, you imagine sex worker. Mm-hmm. That tends to be the thing. So you think about a young woman who is trapped in some sort of awful prostitution thing. The reality, though, is that that's actually that's not what it is in its entirety. Most human trafficking, and this is part of the entire picture, is guest workers.
Yeah.
And it's folks who have come here and they've been trapped. There's one restaurant in Rhode Island that actually had a house that they chained people up in. They would padlock the outside of the door so that way they could only go from the house to work and back.
Right.
That's enslavement. The fish plants of New Bedford. They have been caught numerous times doing that. The myth of the taxation, the whole idea that, like, the foundational myth that we have in the country is this place that hardworking people do the right thing, pay their taxes, and just demanded some sort of political recourse for that, all on their own, completely out of whole cloth with no else attached to it, even though the entire structure was supported by unbelievable misery and expropriation
Right.
of labor and land,
Right.
which is ongoing. And so you see that in the treatment of the indigenous population on reservations now, where you talk about the Flint water crisis, which is a crisis, but on reservations there is no water on some of them.
Mm-hmm.
Or they get a water delivery once a week of a few gallons. That is that's a choice. That's a policy choice that's made. When you put in Providence, 1 in 3 African American men in prison, that's a policy decision. That's not these thousands of people doing something wrong every day. That's saying we're just going to have somebody sitting over them and saying, the minute you step out of line, the minute you do that, whatever. Or if you don't step out of line. If you just
Right.
do something that would be normal for any college-age kid to do. But these are never said college-age kids. These are never thought of in those terms. They're never thought of in any term other than youth from South Providence or whatever.
Right. I mean, and if they're in Brown, I mean, how many Brown grads have lit up a doobie
Right.
at some point in their college career, and how many Brown grads have had their life destroyed as a result?
Right, right. And so like that level of luck that
The answer is none.
yeah, none. No, they all end up being they might, I don't know.
They might get a ticket.
They might get a ticket, but they probably won't.
They probably won't.
Because one of the arguments that I've heard judges say is, well, you have such a bright future, I wouldn't want to mar your future. And that's a really horrible thing to say to everyone that's not them.
Well, you know, we could talk about judges are another pet peeve of mine, because we've seen with the death of Scalia, while he was in the process of taking a bribe, he dies.
Yeah,
right.
yeah, it's pretty great.
And then the Congress is saying we're not going to allow any new replacement justice, which is completely unprecedented, historically speaking, and also a violation of their previous agreements. Which, if you believe that they would hold to, I mean, you were crazy, but they did make these agreements, and you know they chose to act without integrity. So but it is interesting, because another thing that people talk about is how that I like to talk about, bugaboo of mine, is that all the judges, all the nominees for the Supreme Court, all of Obama's, all of them for a long time, they've all been people whose entire career has been trying to get on the Supreme Court.
Right. They're also, all of them are Ivy League, and all of them worked in New York. It's
Right.
very unique.
Right. It's very hard to believe that people from such a homogenous background, regardless of characteristics like gender and race, which may or may not represent actual movement forward. You know, I mean, we could talk about Clarence Thomas and how
He did the right thing in the cross-burning case. He did the right thing in the cross-burning case.
well, I'm not familiar with that, but that would be the one time.
It is, in fact.
It is. I honestly feel bad for him, because it's like one of these Alzheimer's patients. His brain just died, but his body is still taking.
Yeah, he's still going along.
Right. I mean, what's he going to do now? He doesn't have Scalia to think for him.
It
But-
does mean that the court has been. I mean, it was better with Marshall, but it has been. The people who constitute, like having a black person on the bench, does change the context. Having women on the bench does also change the context. The thing that it doesn't change the class perspective.
Right.
And since so much of what impacts people in this country, like it's the fraternal twins, or the two sides of the coin. Like, one side is race in this country, and the other side is class. And though they're not always analogous to each other, they do play pretty.
Well,
closely.
in a way, you know, I really think that racism is it's one of these things where it's taken on this horrific life of its own, but it existed in the beginning when race was being constructed to serve the interests of classes.
Yeah, no. So,
right.
well,
It's now gone way beyond that.
This
obviously.
is the narrative. The narrative, or again, like when we think of national myth narratives, one of the myths that we have is the picture of a working class person, which is almost always a male, hard hat wearing thing, immigrant or whatever. Like that's always the picture that we give, and then we have this history of it where my people came from Ireland and blah blah blah. We went through this, or they came from Italy and blah blah blah. We went through all this stuff. All of them came with some other aspirational goal. All immigrant groups, for the most part, except for the ones that were like tricked into working in the factories and stuff like that, came here with, I'm going to make my fortune, I'm escaping something. There's some place that they're going to get to
Right.
after they're across the
I
border.
have this awesome religion, and I want to be able to persecute people
Yeah,
who don't agree with it.
Yeah. There was always some other thing that they're going towards. The only population of people in this country, the only one that was brought here for a specific purpose to work and never was allowed a place to even dream outside of that purpose are African Americans. Only one. They're the only actual, if you could have a natural population, natural working class population in the country. For indigenous populations, having something removed is the motivating force. For African Americans, it is having your labor removed, but also knowing that that's the only place that you're going to be.
Well, not just your labor, your identity, your entire entire world. I mean,
right, and it's defined by these things. So, like, if you look at Providence, where the African American population is in Providence right now, you have three distinct population centers around Mount Pleasant, South Providence, and around Chad Brown. 80% of all African Americans in Providence were moved from their ancestral homes in 1977. All of them. That's 80% of the population of black folks were uprooted and shifted someplace else through whatever urban renewal plan that was happening. That is a regional or municipal trauma to a single population. It disrupted complete communities, it separated families, and it's also something that's an ongoing process. Black folks live in this country to be moved and to be used in one regard or another. And as a working population, that's the definition. I mean, that's actually the definition. The American dream for black folks doesn't involve a house or a picket fence or anything like that. It involves growing up, collecting Social Security, staying alive. It's a completely different mountaintop. And I think that we forget that sometimes. And I think that when we think of class issues, we think of them as sort of as something that's kind of universally understood in this country.
Right.
But they're not, because other populations are aspirational, and one population is what it is. And I think that changes the way you think about it.
Well, I think that you can't. There's a big tendency, especially right now, to talk about it as if because the class system has gotten so out of control, because capitalism is destroying the planet and has spawned all these other horrors, which have a life of their own. There's a tendency to focus on that, and I think that is probably. I think by and large I tend to validate that, just because if we don't do something about that, we won't solve global warming if we don't solve capitalism.
Right. Well, I'm not.
Right. We won't get world peace if we don't solve capitalism.
This is there's a conversation I had about,
and we won't get racial justice if we don't solve capitalism.
Right.
Either.
Well, that's the Martin Luther King, Dr. King, and Bayard Rustin and all those guys kind of understood that there had to be a more creative way of thinking about economic and political systems than the ones that are offered now. He had a very human version of socialism that he really that he believed in very, very strongly. And Bayard Rustin believed in until he went a little south on a couple other things. The capitalism is dependent on individuality and individualism as an idea. That any concept of sharing something is inherently structurally wrong. It's a completely loser-based system. Like there are three there are three categories in capitalism, and everybody falls into one of those three categories, and you cannot break people out of them. You have the capitalist who owns stuff. You have the person who serves capitalism, who does stuff for the person who owns stuff, and then you have the extra. And the extra can serve as either as a tool against, in which case suddenly they have utility. But as soon as you take people out of utility, their capitalism has no need for it. And then on the level of capitalists, you have the competition, or your people who are in your enterprise with you. And either your goal as a capitalist is to get your competition to become the extra.
Right.
And so there's never a point where you're going to have a system that isn't going to take something away. Like the shirtwaist strikers, the shirtwaist fire anniversary was, I think, a couple of days ago. All those women burned to death making shirts for people in a horrible, horrible sweatshop. It's easily one of the biggest tragedies that labor suffered, and was like the real impetus to start a more aggressive union among women in New York, and that's great. The outcome of that is great. But Bangladesh a couple of years ago, we saw an identical fire. So it's not like capitalism reformed itself.
No, it just went somewhere else.
It just moved.
Right.
And in moving, it destroys more. And so one of the conversations that I've had about race and capitalism and kind of this idea that NAFTA, this is one of the great conspiracy theories of all time, so you enjoy it, sit back for a minute, is that white working class people in the 1990s, in the late 1990s, were motivated pretty aggressively to work against NAFTA. And you started to see environmental groups and traditional white labor organizations kind of unite against this trade deal for the first time. It was the beginning of an anti-globalization movement, which is great, anti-global capital. It's a wonderful thing to work against. The irony, of course, is that African Americans' experience has always been one of global capital, that there's never been a non-global capitalist moment. Historically brought over on ships that were owned in corporation with people. They were owned in corporation with people to work on plantations that were owned in these giant national, multinational corporations as well, for shares that were spread out internationally between one person to another, to be shifted from working in the South and facing racist terror down there to coming to the North to work in these international factories that were owned. There is no non-global moment for African Americans. So it's like, even though African Americans as a population have the least amount of passports in the country, they're automatically cosmopolitan by the nature of where they're at. There's a citizenry of the world based on them, and an understanding of that. And I think that when you look to class analysis and you look to economic issues that are affecting us right now, you see the erosion of teachers' salaries, you see the erosion of infrastructure, you see a globalization of municipal capital, of what traditionally had been public asset, and that's something that black folks are very, very familiar with. They were uprooted just 30 years ago and moved en masse to different places.
Right.
Rhode Island, that is capital at work.
Yeah, well, behold your future, everyone.
There it is. That's one big conspiracy.
I don't know if that's a conspiracy theory or not, because again, I really feel like these systems, there's no one architect at the top who can understand the entire system and is actively managing it. There's not even a group of people who do that. I mean, there's a global economic summit in Davos.
Right. No, it benefits.
Gina Raimondo wants her buddies to pay for it.
It benefits. Well, yeah, she wanted us to pay for it. It benefits enough small people to act in service to it for enough.
Exactly.
Exactly.
There's always going to be people who are happy to be complicit.
Right. And then you see it manifest in ways of, we don't want Section 8 housing. We don't, it's legal for Rhode Island landlords to discriminate against people who have Section 8 vouchers. That's saying that you want to maximize your profit in rent.
Yeah.
And that's a little slice of capitalism doing some work right there, harming another group of people. I mean, that's in our own backyard.
Well, this has been so great. Thank you so much, Mike. I'd love to keep talking to you for another hour, but we both got
Yeah,
You got other
I got
people
people
waiting.
showing up.
You got a line. You got a queue
got a
forming
line.
at your door here.
Yeah.
So thanks so much, Mike.
It's a pleasure. Man.
This has been the Grim Wisdom Podcast. I think that was pretty grim for y'all. So mission accomplished. What's up?